Now, there are very few instances where U.S. government employees have been recruited by the MSS on an ideological basis. That is relatively rare. On the other hand, we have noticed that the MSS now believes money is a good way to get an American officer to turn over classified information.
Welcome to Crossroads. I'm your host, Joshua Philipp. Today we're at the National Press Club in Washington, and we have with us Robert Booth. He's the former Deputy Director of Counterintelligence at State Department, and he's also author of the book, State Department Counterintelligence. And so, Robert, real pleasure having you on Crossroads.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be here.
And I know you came with some pretty interesting information. Of course, you've talked about this before. You've been talking about it for a while. The issue of foreign spies working on U.S. payrolls at American embassies in different countries. This is a pretty crazy sounding issue, and I know you've been trying to tell people about this for a while now.
Well, it sounds pretty bad, and what really happens is you go back to the first American embassy that was created in Moscow in 1934, and in order to have an embassy that operates well, you have to have a number of what we call back then foreign service nationals or locally engaged staff, and that would be Russian citizens who worked inside the American embassy as translators, chauffeurs, budget and fiscal people, people who helped move embassy people from apartment to whatever. And we couldn't get enough Americans to go there, and it's very costly. So what we did is we supplemented the American with locally engaged staff, in other words, Russian citizens working inside the embassy.
And when you're dealing with a country like that is hostile to the United States, I would imagine the chances of them not being spies, or at the very least being groomed and possibly threatened by the government if they don't play along, is pretty low, right?
Well, in fact, in October 30th, 1940, it's a report called the Beck Report, and that was two FBI officers traveled under diplomatic courier status and traveled to the American embassy in Moscow because there were rumors reaching back to Washington, D.C. that the locally engaged staff at the American embassy in Moscow, in fact, were assets of the local NKVD, the Russian intelligence services, and actual NKVD spies. And there's a difference between the two. And they were taking advantage of very lax security on the part of the American embassy officers. And these two FBI agents wrote a report. It was given to J. Edgar Hoover, who then passed it on to the Attorney General with a thought of passing it to the Secretary of State, so the Secretary of State could see that when you engage locally engaged staff to work inside the embassy itself, there are tremendous vulnerabilities that present itself.
This is still a problem. Of course, we first started seeing it in Moscow. Still a problem today, is what you've been saying.
If the local intelligence services did not attempt to take advantage of the fact that their own citizens, loyal French, Israeli, Panamanian, Chinese, Russian, are inside an American embassy, and they didn't take advantage to try to recruit one or two of those locally engaged staff as assets, then that intelligence service is not doing their job.
And so, Robert, I know this was, of course, your job at State Department was helping educate diplomats and such about the possible threats of this, and this was a problem, from what I understand, you observed during that whole tenure. Could you tell us about this?
The counterintelligence staff at the Department of State is responsible for educating Foreign Service officers and actually officers of other agencies who work or reside inside an American embassy about the counterintelligence threat. Some countries have a higher counterintelligence threat than others. So I was actually assigned to the United States Liaison Office in Beijing, China in 1975. And at that particular point, there were a certain number of locally engaged staff who actually worked inside the liaison office. And we in the intelligence community knew that at least one or two of those Foreign Service nationals, that they were called back then, had to be actual, they weren't called MSS back then, I think they're called the Criminal Investigations Division, CID.
And that's the Chinese equivalent of like CIA, FBI?
Certainly the FBI, CIA, it's always, we don't really truly understand that, but they were assets of their intelligence service. And we always suspected a gentleman by the name of Mr. Wren, who worked inside the liaison office, was in fact an intelligence officer. In 1981, some 6 years later, I was assigned to protect the foreign minister of China who came to the United States. Now, diplomatic security, the State Department, that's one of our jobs. They think it's Secret Service, but it's not. But in any case, I ended up at the Chinese liaison office to the UN in New York. I walk inside the Chinese mission, and who do I see walking behind their lines but Mr. Ren as a political officer? So that to me was a clear indication that Mr. Ren, while he was working inside the liaison office at the United States liaison office in Beijing, he was a hardcore spy. Not an asset, but a hardcore spy.
Was that an awkward moment?
We just both smiled at each other, and he got it that I understood now who he was, and our suspicions were correct. And I assuming our intelligence community had kind of figured out Mr. Ren was a intelligence officer when he arrived in New York. But it was confirmation for me.
And so what are some of the threats currently that we face from this issue? Let's use, for example, China as an example of this, because I know they're right now one of the big topics we're focused on.
Well, it boils down, first of all, to unclassified information that the locally engaged staff can see every day. They have access to what we call the OpenNet, the Unclassified State Department computer system. This is where all the State Department people and other agency people who work inside the American embassies communicate unclassified. But as we all know, a lot of unclassified information, if taken apart piece by piece and put together in the counterintelligence puzzle, then the Ministry for State Security can start to get a better picture of what we're doing. If our commercial officers are asking the locally engaged staff to get certain periodicals, maybe to report on certain things, the locally engaged staff, when they are debriefed by the MSS every 2 weeks at their home or when they have tea, then they can tell the MSS, here's what the commercial officer has asked me to look at. Oh, and by the way, I was going through the unclassified computer system and I saw these are the requests coming in from Thailand or coming in from Tokyo. So I see what's going on in Tokyo, how it relates to Beijing, China. So that alone can give things away.
Looking at the pattern of information and understanding what the possible trajectory is when you put it all together. And the trajectory would show you what the national interest would be in trying to find that information, I assume.
It would, I am not a commercial officer or an economic officer. I can only assume based off what I saw them do and what I knew them to do, that they're out there trying to develop information that sometimes the local countries are unhappy with us learning about, whether we can predict there will be a shortfall in wheat production, a shortfall in millet or sorghum production, be it China, be it whatever. That will give our government advance notice of there might be a demand for wheat or whatever from the United States or other countries. So that if the locally engaged staff can see that's what we're focusing on, or we just reported back that based off local source information, local newspapers, that we can accurately predict an agricultural shortfall, then the local government, so then they know the American government knows about that, so we want to get ahead of the curve, maybe want to buy before this information reaches Washington, D.C.
And what are the actual threats from this? Is it, in terms of, say, military, national interest, and personal safety of, say, I know, for example, in China there were several CIA officers who were killed not too long ago.
What I can say is that there are intelligence officers who work under diplomatic cover overseas. This is, we don't acknowledge it, we don't talk about it, but when retired CIA officers write books about it and say I was assigned an American embassy overseas, then we can't say it. Locally engaged staff, if they're observant enough, if they're whatever, they can identify intelligence officers from any of the intelligence agencies working in an embassy. They can help the MSS really identify which ones are clandestine and what they may be up to.
And I know that one of the ways, of course, in my work at Epic Times, I was a national security reporter doing investigative reporting, and one of my main focuses for years was exposing a lot of the Chinese spy operations in the U.S. And one of the things I came across is how the Chinese Communist Party recruits spies. And what they'll often do is they'll look for moral flaws in an individual: greed, lust, power, money, things they can exploit. And so I would imagine by viewing these individuals and viewing their communications, It's easy. You go on LinkedIn, you type in the company name, you map the entire company, you find the individuals you want to exploit, then you go find their social media. And you look for the guy who's unhappy with his job, unhappy with his marriage, or so on. And then you target them accordingly. This is what they do. And I would assume that having that kind of access would help them in that capacity. Is this accurate?
Unfortunately for the Americans assigned to the People's Republic of China, their apartments are bugged. Their phones are bugged. Their car is bugged. So anytime an American officer is back home in his apartment or his house, and he and his wife are talking about too much drinking maybe, a little extra money needed for Johnny to go to a good college, they can, without too much problem, develop a good vulnerability profile of all our officers. And then inside the embassy itself, there may be other indicators that the locally engaged staff can pick up on that allows the MSS to truly profile an American officer and what his or her vulnerabilities may be. Now, there are very few instances where U.S. government employees have been recruited by the MSS on an ideological basis. That is relatively rare. On the other hand, we have noticed that the MSS now believes money is a good way to get an American officer to turn over classified information.
So, just for our audience, MSS, Ministry of State Security, that's the Chinese kind of internal, mainly intelligence agency, although they do operate abroad a little bit.
It's always a bit complicated for us. In Russia, we know the FSB is relatively equivalent to the FBI, and the SVR is relatively equivalent to the CIA. In China, it's the two PLA and the MSS. So the MSS was created in 1983. It really wasn't that powerful, but with their local state security bureaus inside China, they are more like the FBI, but they are those who identify and attempt to recruit assets to the Chinese government. Yes.
And so I know in part of your work, you were helping educate our diplomats on how to not get exploited. Could you tell us about some of the work you did?
As the deputy director, one of the things we'd reach out to all our counterparts in the intelligence community and ask them to tell us what their officers had also seen in the field. And we would get together and we created a program where every single American officer who was assigned to China would receive a counterintelligence Chinese-specific briefing before they went overseas. When they got to the post, we also had another more in-depth counterintelligence briefing for all the officers to remind them of what we saw the threat being. Remind them you can't talk in your house. Remind them be careful what you say in a car. The telephone is going to be bugged. Be careful about your laptop. All that is all vulnerable. Remind them of that. And then what we would do is when we started building the buildings in Beijing and then Guangzhou, we briefed all the workers. Every single American worker that went to build that building was briefed by my office, and they signed an acknowledgement form. And when they got there, they were rebriefed every 6 months. We believe education, an aggressive program of talking to our officers and reminding them report contact responsibilities. There are obligations that an officer has when he and she serves overseas about they must let us know when they meet individuals in that country and they agree to meet them again for a second time, they're obligated to come and let the counterintelligence officers know about this individual so we can do more background checks to see whether this individual represents a counterintelligence threat to the officer.
And now getting back to the issue of these locally engaged staff working in these embassies, I mean, what are some of the scenarios you've come across that made you concerned enough to want to go and talk about this?
Just to give you a bland example, which you wouldn't even think about, when American officers go to eat in the cafeteria, they normally like to eat with their counterparts who work in the embassy. And the locally engaged staff who serves and waits on the tables and takes care of the cafeteria, they can start to see who likes to associate with whom, whatever. So that very quickly they can determine the cliques in the embassy, who the power sharers are, who the power holders are, who's might in, who might be out. It just gives them a profile of the individuals right there. We also found out that, as another example, it's not an indicator, but it's an example, is that intelligence officers do not have trash in their trash cans. So when the locally engaged staff would come around at night to clean up the office, they're under the guard of the Marine security guards. But the locally engaged staff could say for 5 straight days, one officer in one part of the embassy never has trash in the trash can. It's an indicator. So when that locally engaged cleaning staff goes back every week or every 2 weeks, debriefed by his MSS handler, he says, okay, what did you see when you cleaned out all the offices, let's say in the administrative section or whatever? He says, well, there's that one new officer who's arrived, he never or she never has trash in the trash can. So that's using the cleaning crew to give the MSS an idea of who someone may or may not be in reality.
And just to illustrate, I think, for our viewers, the seriousness of, or let's say the importance of embassies and what their functions are. A lot of guys will say, oh, well, the purpose of embassies is local intelligence gathering, which technically means just, reading newspapers, talking to local diplomats, talking to people, and giving our politicians information on what they should be aware of with that country. A lot of times that's benign. There's nothing bad about it. But of course, countries will want to control how they're perceived by their adversaries or even friends.
Oh, absolutely. And I think what all intelligence services need to do is, if they can have foreknowledge of our intentions and our diplomatic initiatives, it simply allows that government to be ahead of us in negotiations, ahead of us on our diplomatic initiatives. So if the locally engaged staff can give just enough hints about potential economic negotiations, commercial operations that are going on, little tidbits here and there, an American delegation comes into Shanghai or Beijing, and the locally engaged staff are helping them. If the locally engaged staff can learn little tidbits, it would allow the Chinese intelligence service to pass on information to the Chinese Communist Party about where they suspect or what they believe that delegation is up to. About 2 years ago, an American officer by the name of Candace Claiborne, who was assigned to the American consulate in Shanghai, was correctly profiled by the Ministry for State Security as someone who had financial vulnerabilities. She was eventually approached in a very unusual way, which I really can't get into, but eventually started to accept money from the Ministry for State Security, providing them relatively low-grade information, but enough and the kinds of information that they wanted. And at one point, when she came back to the United States, the Ministry for State Security kept following up with her, and at one point they asked her for information about an upcoming economic delegation going to China. And she then said she got open source information and sent it to them. And they came back a week later and said, no, we don't want this stuff. We want to know what's going on inside your office, inside the State Department. So it was very clear that what the MSS wanted from this American Foreign Service officer was the rumors, the talk, what's going on, who's going to be representing, do we have any ideas, who's going to be the tough guy, who's going to be the less tough guy. And that's the information. It's not top secret, it's almost low grade, but that's what the MSS wanted to know as the American negotiating team was prepared to go.
Now, from what I understand, this is kind of a known issue that there are foreign spies working at our consulates, and the reason it's not being solved is mainly because of costs. Could you explain this to us?
The concrete example we have of that actually occurred in Moscow many years ago when, after we asked a number of Russian diplomats to leave the embassy, I think it was 1985 under Ronald Reagan, that the Russians responded by pulling out all the locally engaged staff at the American embassy in Moscow, which caused the embassy almost to collapse. All the operations, the cleaning, the washing, the translation services, the couriers, the chauffeurs, we didn't have them anymore. So that caused our officers then to do the pedantic work of emptying the trash cans, cleaning the floors. And they couldn't do the work because not all the American officers spoke Russian. The science officer maybe didn't speak Russian. He or she had to go out in the countryside and do their work. And without Russian translators and speakers, they were unable to do the job. So Congress said, okay, what would it take to replace the 100 most important locally engaged staff in Moscow with Americans? And what you have to remember is, if we're going to take 100 Americans now and send them to Moscow, we have to get housing for them. We have to send them overseas. We've got to buy the tickets. If they have family members, we have to put those kids in school. You have to take care of the spouse. And the next thing you know, to get 100 Americans to fill in for the locally engaged staff in Moscow started reaching $100 million over the course of a couple of years. And so
for just about every single embassy too, I assume.
Well, we're just talking about Moscow. Moscow represented a particular risk at that particular time because you may or may not remember the Russians were able to get listening devices inside the new building, and we actually had to tear down the top three floors, and rebuild it at a cost of $100 million plus. So we realized that locally engaged staff can represent a risk, but at the same time to replace them, but also. Let me play devil's advocate, that then puts 100 more Americans on Russian soil who then the KGB could then try to exploit if these workers have vulnerabilities. So it's a real balance there. Some would say if you send 100 Americans to Moscow and a couple are custodians, a couple are workers and so on, you might be sending what we call lower hanging fruit. These are people who probably don't have an education in counterintelligence. They probably don't have an understanding of what Russian culture is all about. Might engage in risky or vulnerable behavior there in Moscow.
So more staff may also, is a threat in its own right too, because you're dealing with individuals who we might have to lower the standards for because you need so many more of them. Is that accurate?
I couldn't have said it any better than that, Josh. You got it right. And that's the fear from the counterintelligence side, that you mitigate it by removing them, but you put more personnel on soil. And once you take an American and put them in their backyard, they're all vulnerable. There's not an apartment outside the compound in Moscow where an American embassy officer, and it can be the science officer, it can be the agricultural officer, that total apartment is not bugged from front door to bedroom to telephone. And we tell them all that. We warn every American officer going to Moscow. And while they're in Moscow, please remember that threat is there. And remember, the locally engaged staff come into that apartment to fix things. The electrician, the plumber, the American officer, oh my gosh, there's something wrong with the floor, the door's not here, the radiator's not working. Who comes into the apartment? The Russian plumber, the Russian electrician. So there is no safety in the apartments.
Well, I know even when you're dealing with things like HVAC, like the systems that run your air conditioner, there are security issues with that. I know individuals who run private security companies, and they go and check big companies for bugs, and they find them oftentimes. Or even, funny enough, the printers, they've found in printers, taking them apart, that they'll have like relays. So every time you print or copy a document, it's sending a copy to a foreign office of some kind.
We found out in Moscow, the Russians were able to get a bugging device inside the Selectric 3 typewriters. So while
the old typewriter.
The old typewriters, exactly correct. And so while the officer or secretary is actually typing, each time they hit a key, and for those who don't know what a Selectric typewriter is, the keys hit a piece of paper. But the Selectric had a little ball that stood up and hit, and each one was a unique stroke. And the carriage was modified, so every time a key was struck, it sent out a message. It was picked up by an antenna. And the bad thing was about these messages would be written in clear text. They were not being enciphered. So when the officer finished the document in clear text and was to take it upstairs to be encrypted, the Russians already had it in clear text. They were reading the classified documents in real time.
Well, in the bigger threat of that, I know I've interviewed people in the past talking about, for example, when the State Department cables were leaked, I had a contact tell me that the real threat with that wasn't so much the cables, but that if a country had the encrypted version and the unencrypted version of something, they could use the unencrypted version to basically crack the encryption keys, because you know which symbol relates to what, basically. I mean, all you have to do is look at time of written document and so on.
It would still be very hard to do because they're electronic bursts. I don't want to go into exactly how it's done, but it would certainly make the job of the Russian decoders make it much easier for them to do. Absolutely.
You've painted an interesting picture that there's this huge intelligence threat ongoing, currently happening. At the same time, getting rid of them may not work because, first of all, costs, and then the other option is having our own people go there, which means more potential threats of being exploited. What do you recommend?
Well, I think what we came up with in Beijing, China is a good mitigation program, and that is in the A building is where all the American officers are located. that handle most of the sensitive information. The B building is the administrative section, and the American officers who work there normally don't handle classified. They're the people, budget and fiscal, human resources, general services officers. These are the people that maintain the embassy and the offices or buildings or homes where the American officers live. I mean, I can talk about this now, and this we found out in France, is for some silly reason, on an unclassified sheet that came out every year, the names of all the officers in France were listed, and then they had a special group of numbers which indicated their retirement group, what their retirement code was. Well, certain officers didn't have the same retirement plan who worked inside the same section as other officers. It doesn't take a genius to realize those are not State Department officers. So that kind of unclassified information allowed certainly the French intelligence service to know who at that embassy may not be who they say they are. So that's open source information. So in the B building in China, that's all information. We've pretty much scrubbed that. We've learned our lesson. And then in the consular section, you have locally engaged staff working with Americans in issuing visas and non-immigrant visas. So in the A building, no locally engaged staff. They can't be in there. Some political officers may task a locally engaged staff in the B building to do work for them on reading and about Chinese newspapers and going through and pulling out articles that they want, but they're not allowed to be inside the building. But it doesn't mean the locally engaged staff in the other part, a B building, can't then know what the political officer is asking him or her to focus on in local Chinese newspapers, periodicals, or whatever.
And so those are two additional issues I think we would have then. One, you mentioned the visas. Locally engaged staff are the ones who work on or do the initial interviews for the visas. And number two, they're the ones reading the Chinese articles and telling people what it says. How, I guess on the reading the articles part, how is that different from just going straight to Chinese, propaganda sources? And two, with the visa part, how do you deal with them not, say, clearing people of their interests and denying people against their interests?
He or she, the locally engaged staff, just makes sure that the form is filled out right, that the person who's applying for an American visa, I'm like, a B1 visa, we have some tourists, we have a tremendous amount of Chinese students who come to the United States under student visas. I think at this particular point there's over 300,000 Chinese students in the United States, graduate, postgraduate, and all the rest. So they would show up at the American embassy in Beijing or the consulate in Guangzhou or whatever, and the first person who they would probably get interviewed by would be a locally engaged staff who speaks Mandarin. I mean, not all our consular officers have that command of the Chinese language. So they would do the first vetting. They'd look at it, you've filled out all the forms, you've done everything like this, and then the locally engaged staff would take that document, if everything was prepared, and then go to the American office and say, he or she, the applicant, has filled out everything the way you're supposed to. Now you, Mr. American, you take it from here. So the first vetting I'm not too worried about, because when that Chinese applicant actually shows up at the American embassy with software recognition that Chinese cameras have across the street, they pretty much know who's going inside. There might be one or two surprises. They might also suspect that a Chinese applicant may go in and apply for political refugee status after he gets beyond the Chinese vetting that sees the American officer for the first time. So there could be concerns, but normally the only thing that the Chinese locally engaged staff can do is confirm the person did come in and did apply for this kind of visa. He would not know what the Chinese citizen would then tell the American officer after the first clear vetting.
Great. And Robert, I guess just last question. What do you hope people take away from this? If you're to communicate one issue with what you're telling me and telling our audience, what would it be?
I'd like the audience to appreciate is the fact that American embassies are tasked with providing Washington, D.C. and the National Security Council with the best possible information about what any country is doing, what their intentions are, what their diplomatic initiatives are too. Unfortunately, Americans are terrible at languages. We really don't teach it at high school and colleges. We don't master it. So that when you have a large embassy in Beijing and lacking that many Americans who are fluent language speakers, we are going to have to hire locally engaged staff to assist. And we try to mitigate the potential vulnerabilities by having a strong counterintelligence program. But understand that the Ministry for State Security and all the others will take full advantage, and it's up to us, the officers serving those embassies, to be on high alert to that vulnerability.
And so, Robert, where can people find your book?
State Department Counterintelligence, Leaked Spies and Lies. You can get on Amazon. I think is the best way to do it.
Okay. Real pleasure having you on Crossroads.
Thank you so much for having me here.
And everyone, please remember to like and subscribe. See you next time.